There we go. Okay, so people are filing into the room. That always unnerves people when they say that. They start looking behind you. The people are filing in. Lovely, that's great. Thank you very much. Very, very welcome, everybody. Nice to see so many people. Lots of people coming in from right across the UK. Welcome to UNISON's 7th webinar, organising webinar, we're calling them. Not just any old webinar, it's an organising webinar. Very important work that's going on during lockdown. I think we've got another one following this one, so avid viewers who've been following the webinar series, there's going to be another one before we kind of break for the summer, really. But we'll let you have more details on that at the end. We've got, for people who are joining us, there is a toolbar on the right-hand side, and you can see on there there's an audio button. So if you want to test your audio and just make sure you can hear what's happening, I'm going to keep talking so that people can get an idea of levels. That's for you to try out. I think there's an option to ring in as well if you don't get through using your computer audios. The webinar is going to be recorded, so if you have, for any reason, you have to miss or you want to send it out for people, we can do that as well. We can send it. I'll send the link out if you're attending anyway, and the other link will be on the organising space. I'll make sure that's available for people. We're going to have, if we have time at the end of the webinar, we will have questions. So back to the toolbar on the right hand side, you will see an area that says question. So you can type those into there, and if we have time, we'll ask a few questions at the end, which would be nice. But if we haven't got time, we can get back to you with those questions if that's if that's necessary. So questions, comments, anything you like in there. The webinar will not go on for more than 1 hour. I know that people are it's not easy. Some people are using their break times, their lunch times to listen to the webinar, so it's quite important that we keep to fairly strict time. So in a few minutes I'm going to bow out, and then I'll come back in before the end of the webinar. So that's it. That's good. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to our esteemed Assistant General Secretary, Roger McKenzie, who will introduce Asad. And thank you very much. You're very welcome to join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. So sporting my new new headphones for the first time. So this makes me look a little bit like, what's her name? Princess Leia, isn't it? It's one of those sort of things. But anyway, they work really well, and I can actually hear what's going on at the moment. So I really want to welcome everybody who's joined us once again for the latest UNISON Organising webinar. What we try to do with these webinars is to look at organising from a whole range of different perspectives, thinking about community, thinking about workplaces, thinking about the full gamut, really, of the way that people look to try and build power for themselves in their workplaces and in their communities, as a way of standing up against people who often try and exploit us, again, in our workplaces or in our communities. One of the great things for me about these webinars is that I've been able to come and have some conversations with some of my friends, basically, but people who are doing really excellent work across our movement, and today's no exception. Delighted to that the Executive Director of War on Want, Asad Rehman, is able to join us from his busy schedule. Me and Asad go way back. Asad was saying before we came on, we both had hair at that time, and he's still got the beard. I never had the beard, but I had the hair. But Asad, as you all hear, has just been doing some outstanding work, and it was just too good an opportunity to miss to have a conversation with my brother here about some of the experiences that he's experienced on his journey, but also as we get towards the end to hear a little bit about some of the priorities of War on Want, some of the challenges that it faces in these, as Angela Davis called, extraordinary times, quite rightly called extraordinary times. But times have always been difficult and quite extraordinary at times for Black people. And I think that's part of the discussion that we want to have today. So welcome, Asad. Thanks for giving up your time to come and join us.
Always a pleasure, and thank you for the invitation. As you said, it's great to chat with fellow comrades and about both the past struggles and the challenges we face moving forward, and our responsibility to our communities and our people, both here and globally.
Absolutely. I mean, I want to start, I suppose, at the beginning. So you're born in Pakistan, came over to Burnley. Tell us a little bit about growing up in Burnley as a young Asian.
Well, I have this love-hate relationship with Burnley, in the sense I'm a passionate Burnley fan. I love the time.
We don't talk about football on this, because people will know who I support and all the rest of it.
But as a town growing up, it was very typical of many of the northern, what are called white working class towns, right? Where there was a minority community, Black and Asian. These were working class towns that were basically being deindustrialized, had lost, big infrastructure from mining to etc. So rising unemployment, in poverty, and then a first generation community coming in, primarily recruited to work in the cotton industry and the knitting factories, and then of course during globalization those beginning to shut down. So it had a huge number of issues and challenges, and it was difficult for as a community. We were as I was growing up, we're the first in everything. So first to go to the school system, the first to encounter racist violence in the schools, the first generation to grow up on watching their parents being racially abused in the streets, seeing them attacked, listening to them tell their stories about racism in the workplace, about how they were the ones that were sacked first when there were job cuts, how they got lower pay than their other counterparts in terms of work, how their criticisms of the labour movement as well, even though they brought this strong tradition of being very much like in the labour movement, because they came from traditions of organising, of struggles, and telling stories of their own struggles of anti-colonialism.
Just on that, Asad, because I think a lot of people kind of don't really appreciate that legacy, that history. So people who fought colonialism quite often, organising against colonialism, but also understanding that there is a labour movement elsewhere that is organised and trying to fight exploitation in the workplace, and many people who came over to the UK brought that tradition of organising with them.
Absolutely, it was the idea that Black communities, and I use the word Black as in political Black, Asian, African, Caribbean, that they learned organising in this country. Actually, they learned organising in their own countries of origin and brought a lot of those principles and enriched the broader labour movement and organising. In fact, I always say to people, if you look back at the big marches of the 60s and 70s against racism, the banners that you see from our community are not political banners. They are banners of community organizations, of associations, of workers' associations. Very famously, the Indian Workers Association, for example, have brought this very strong tradition of left organizing in the Asian community. And that was reflected in lots of pivotal moments. Grunwick and Imperial Typewriter strikes, but also in how that community immediately associated itself with you know, the broader labour movement, both the Labour Party, but also trade unionism. People saw it as something that was important to do because they understood that their sense of belonging was always about the we and not the I. And so whether that was organising as a community together to be able to safeguard each other, or to build community institutions, or the we more collectively, they were very much, you know, what I would call, they had the principles of that solidarity and collectivism is the way that you know, you're able to enhance and amplify your power, and you're able to further your, you know, the needs of your community. So it's been a very central part of organising. And you know, and I as a young kid, I used to watch that. I was not so long ago, you know, we were having a chat with somebody and said it's incredible now to look back at that period, and people, I think, maybe forget what that was like growing up being black in Britain, right? I mean, you know, of course, you know, there's Paul Gilroy's famous book, you know, there ain't no black in the Union Jack, but that was what we were told, right, every single day of our lives. And you know, as I grew up in a community that was, my house was firebombed daily. We would get National Front graffiti when the father would go to work. You'd have gangs trying to terrorize the women in the community because they understood that they were at home. The children were still too young. We would fight our way to school from racist gangs. We had the National Front selling the bulldog in my school. We had teachers turning a blind eye to racist violence. Black kids, we would barricade ourselves into classrooms at lunchtime to basically escape, you know, the bashing and race, fight our way all the way back home. You know, going to the town centre was, you know, was always, it was a tense moment because you never knew at what point somebody would say something that was racist. You'd be assaulted physically, verbally, and it was a community living, I suppose, in terror in that sense, because the state, both from the local authority to the police, were turning a blind eye, weren't listening to what that community said. And so as soon as I was like 14, 15, you know, one of my first things, we organized a school strike against racist violence. I joined set up an Asian youth movement, took part in anti-racist struggles, because not as an abstract ideal, but because it was, you know, the Asian youth movement used to have this slogan, here to stay, here to fight. And was, you know, that was like just the day-to-day reality. If we wanted to stay here, we had to be able to fight. To fight, we had to organize. And that meant setting up political formations of community organizations and youth organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. So I remember having a conversation recently, it might have been another kind of video rally conference thing, meeting, and I remember talking about, and you kind of mentioned it earlier on, about what it actually does to you inside when you see your parents getting abused, racially abused. And I remember my mom was, one of the jobs that my mom did was she was a cleaner, and she used to clean at the town hall, and over the road was the health authority. So that was her 2 shifts, and she used to just do them back to back. And she used to say to us to come down into Walsall, where I'm from. We used to have to come down and meet her, particularly during the winter months, because it was, even the walk to the bus stop was dangerous. But actually, normally what happened was that there wasn't a lot of spare money for buses. So it meant walking up the hill in Walsall, Karma Hill, walking up to our house, but she wasn't going to do that on her own. So me and my brother used to have to take it in turns to come down, and it was always because there was regular abuse and attacks against her. Of course, me and my brother being there just meant that we all got attacked, but at least you're putting yourself in front of what your mom is experiencing. But I always remember what that felt like, and I think people need to kind of reflect on that a little bit, that it really does do something to you when your parents are getting attacked regularly, and you know that as a little child, really, and it's not a lot you can do against these grown men as they were.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, we carry the physical scars of that period, but we also carry, you know, the emotional and trauma from that period, and then we try and express it in different ways. You know, recently, you know, I was trying to remind people of, you know, that solidarity between our communities and the diverse Black communities was built through collective struggle.
Absolutely.
And racists at the time didn't differentiate between what we were and who we were. And I was saying, you know, there was the little acts of rebellion that you used to have to do, and it reminded me of, you know, when Roots first came on television. Right?
Yeah.
Roots came on television, every racist would call you Kunta Kinte, right?
Absolutely.
And say you have to say that. And then as the episodes of Roots moved on, and they said, you know, and they gave him his slave name, and they'd make you want to say your name is Toby, and we'd say no, we're Kunta Kinte. And that little act of rebellion, to me, it sparked off this big conversation. Like, I need to understand why, because the kids that I see are being racist to me, you know, they're living in the same poverty that I am, right? It's not like we're living in the same crappy neighborhoods with the same terrible housing, going to the same terrible schools. Why is it that their anger and expression is directed at us as a community? And where does this hatred come from, right? How is it that, you know, kids that I went to junior school with, that my mum used to feed breakfast to in the morning, white kids, you know, within 3 to 4 years later, would be shouting NF slogans and taking part in racist textures. And I was always like, what profound change had happened that these kids that I once thought were friends were now with racist gangs. And it made me start to really try and educate myself about, you know, the history of racism, history of our communities, both in the UK, and look to, you know, what was going on. And it opened my eyes to what was going on in the rest of the world. And I still remember, you know, you saw the pictures of South Africa, and you felt immediate solidarity. That was your people and your struggle. You saw Palestine, that was your struggle, your people. I looked at what was going on in Latin America with the Sandinistas, and you immediately felt kinship, that these were also people struggling for that basic thing, the right to a dignity and a dignified life. And that, I think, political solidarity, it's a shame because I think it's sort of been weakened in recent years.
I agree.
Really connected where of our politics, right? That saw where we were in this country as part of a broader issue about where we were globally. And, you know, and it began my political journey into radicalism, and first into the Asian youth movement, and then into, you know, both in the labor movement. But I remember, you know, in the miners' strike, two profound experiences which to me showed me the lessons of political organizing. One, the first picket I ever went to in the miners' strike, I was told I'm not welcome, and some racist comments were made. But then, you know, by the end of that miners' strike, you know, I was in Royal Albert Hall crying as the miners were going back, and the miners themselves had made huge connections with the Black community over experiences of policing, over solidarity of a community in struggle, being marginalized and attacked by the state. And the second thing that just made me again recognize the strength of our elders. You know, my mum, you know, like many first generation, you know, didn't really speak English that much, but she'd watch the pictures of the miners' strike and say, those are our people, they're working people, they are suffering. We should go to the aunties, go and collect some food for them, it's going to help them. And I was like, that is class solidarity, right? There is an immediate solidarity that our community felt, even when it could have so easily turned its back on large sections of the white working class and the labor movement because of their experiences. They still saw that there was something that built, and I recognize, and I think those are two really powerful things that we've always got to remember in our organizing, that politics can be shifted through solidarity, and that power can only be built when we organize. And it stayed with me, and it stayed with me, you know, throughout my political life.
They're profound lessons. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think continuing that journey, I suppose. I mean, two of the really important organisations that developed to not just monitor but to develop organising against racism were the Newham Monitoring Project and the Southall Monitoring Project. You were for a while the chair of Newham Monitoring. Can you tell us a little bit about the Newham Monitoring Project, how it came about, how you came to be involved in it, and just tell us a little bit about some of the activities that they did? Because for me, it's one of the profound issues for us is how we organise against racism to build that kind of class solidarity, and Newham Monitoring and Southall Monitoring were doing that, have been doing that for years. So could you talk a little bit about that for us?
Sure. So, you know, in the late 70s, of course, we all know, you know, the National Front was on the rise, was marching in their thousands, terrorizing communities up and down the country, was standing in elections, was winning considerable amount of the votes, was influencing the political agenda. You had, of course, you know, artists like Eric Clapton using his stage to make racist comments. It was so normalized, right? It was normalized on television with the shows. It was normalized, and as communities, people look to, like, how do we respond to this constant series of attacks that are taking place? And in Newham, in East London, one of a long line of racist attacks and murders that took place was this murder of a young Pakistani medical student called Akhtar Ali Beg, who was killed for a £5 bet by skinheads on a Saturday afternoon on the main high street. Who could stab the first Paki? And these racist gangs stabbed. The Akhtar Ali Beg died, and of course the local community came out on the streets, marched on the police station, you know, highlighting the lack of police response and the ways. And the people who'd been organizing for around all of this said, we just keep coming together, right? Every other day we have to set up either a self-defense group, or we have somebody who's coming in who's telling us what's going on in their families and communities they're under attack, their isolation, the racism, the police violence. We should look at trying to set up something that, you know, tells us true scale of what's happening to our community. Because remember, at this time, the state denied that there was the level of racist violence, would say absolutely not. And if the police did respond, often they would arrest the young black people for defending themselves or their communities and say, this is not racism, this is just gang violence, or they're the criminal. And they set up Newham Monitoring Project. And similarly in Southall, after the racist murders there, and the National Front visited, trying to enter into Southall, and it drew its inspiration actually from the Panthers, right? Because the Panthers said, you know, we have to be armed with the law book in our hand, right? So we have to know our rights, and we have to be organized as a community. And so these groups said, as radical young black people, we have to be rooted in our community, serve our community. The most pressing need of our community is these monitoring organizations. And what they did was they provided a 24-hour emergency support, so you could ring them day or night. They would get you lawyers. If you're under attack, volunteers would come to your home. They would work with you on your cases. They would run campaigns to affect institutional change. And it started off originally around racist violence. Then people recognized that you can't deal with that unless you're also dealing with police violence. And subsequently from that, looking at issues such as deaths in custody, immigration rates. And they were, you know, and each year we would produce a report which would document, you know, what had taken place from communities. And people used to be shocked at, this is the reality of communities living in this country. And so the power of us organizing and documenting was very, very important, but also running very important campaigns. And so I first became aware of Newham, for example, as somebody going through my own struggles in Lancashire, suddenly reading about the fact that there were these young people who had been arrested by the police for defending themselves and their younger siblings from racist attack. And I'd like, that's what we do every day. oh my God, these people are under attack. And so I found out about the UNISON, the self-defense campaigns, and heard this slogan, self-defense is no offense, which rang out from our communities alongside no justice, no peace. And, you know, and I was like, wow, these are people who are really making a difference in our communities. And I was really privileged to be able to work for NMP, work and serve my community, and learned a lot of really incredible lessons about organizing and community organizing at the feet of real, you know, they're people who nobody will remember now, but they were giants of our community, right? They were the people who everybody went to, who set up the community associations, ran the churches, the mosques, the temples. They were the fabric, and they were brave beyond doubt, right? To stand up at that point, at that moment, and they led many of the struggles, and they taught me an immense work and immense lot. And you know, and I was privileged to be able to meet with Sivanandan, and you formulate your ideas with also being suddenly in around these radical Black people who you'd read their books, and now we're having these conversations. How do we respond? And for me, there's a parallel with this moment, and I'm sure you probably feel it, right? You know, there's an immense moment of, like, you know, Black Lives Matter, and it feels a bit like, you know, two moments. It feels like the early 80s, and it feels like the Stephen Lawrence moment.
Absolutely.
And if you remember in the 80s, you know, the state's response was to get us all into race awareness training, where we were talking about we want to tackle structural inequality and racism, about housing, education, police violence, etc. And they were like, no, we need to just tell you, we need to make people aware of each other's cultures. And if you do that, everything will be all right. And I'm sure you still remember that. We used to say, I don't care if you like my samosa steel bands and stuff, what I want is to be able to walk down the street free from attack. That's the thing that I want. And,
absolutely.
You know, and I feel like we're in this weird moment where we're like reproducing that worst thing, that you have this immense outpouring, and then the liberals are trying to take us back into, oh, it's all about your individual. If you suddenly become more conscious, everything will be all right. No, it's the systems of oppression that need to be addressed.
If you understand your unconscious bias, then everything is going to be fine. If you understand that stuff, and you know, I mean, one of the things that always grasps me about those kind of moments in history, I guess, is the way that the response by the states and by employers is always the same. Quick fix solutions is the order of the day, because the main thing is we've got to get people out of the streets. We've got to calm this whole situation down and get everything back to normal as quickly as we can. And it's how we turn, and again, this is one of the kind of statements of the moment, really, is that how do we turn a moment into a movement? And basically you turn a moment into a movement through organizing. No one's going to do this stuff for us. We have to be clear about what our demands are, what is happening on the ground. And so there's no room for confusion, or people can't say that actually, what don't you mean something else? We have to be organized enough to ensure that people hear what it is we've got to say. Very, very similar to the trade union movement, and in terms of what we have to do in workplaces up and down the country, that people actually listen to what it is working people are saying. But one of the things that strikes me the most, Asad, from what you've described, is that quite often what we'll do, and you made the comparison quite rightly, and I kind of see that with the Black Panther movement in the States. Actually, we have so many examples in this country of grassroots organizing. Some real giants within our movement, Sivanandan for one, LaRose another. You know, I mean, so many of these folks who just done extraordinary work in bringing communities together, not just to have a cup of tea or a glass of rum or something, but actually to think about what this means in a radical political sense, and to move people on politically, and also to build movements. Which still exist today. I mean, those two giants have left us now, but they've left such a lasting legacy, and there's so many others, aren't there?
Absolutely. Look, Frank Critchlow at Mangrove,
Yeah.
And and I have to pay to you in this, and in the sense of if you look back at that period, the ecology of Black organizing was immense, right? You had radical community infrastructure being set up, whether it was law centers, monitoring organizations, or community-based organizations. You had Black radicals organizing in the trade union movement, setting up Black workers groups, trade unions, solidarity between. You had the Black sections in the Labour Party connecting. So you had political demands, you had organizing, and that whole ecology was working together, supporting each other. So when workers were out on struggle, they knew they had a community base to rely on. They knew they had political champions in Parliament, and vice versa. Everybody could support each other in the line, which why many of us all know each other, right? Because we were all on the front line of every struggle with each other because they were our collective struggle. And what that period of Thatcherism did in the 80s, was she recognized the threat of Black radicalism that was coming and started a process which was to gut Black infrastructure and community organising. It turned community organising into service providers. So there was no building of power and no challenge of institutional power. It was all about just passive individual service delivery. And so and then they created a part of our community and said, well, now you're the gatekeepers, right? You are the community gatekeepers. You keep everybody passive. You keep everybody, you try and isolate the radicals, and you say, look, those people are radical. When the radicals were the very heart center of our community, right? And we were not radical in that, it was never a label. These were people saw us as they're the people who help our community, right? And how then organizers become demonized and the attempt to isolate them, as they did with Frank, as they did with all of these giants. And I just think, going back to this moment, we have huge protests, but we don't have Black organizing infrastructure and institutions. And now is the moment to rebuild that radical organizing infrastructure, both inside the labor movement and outside of the labor movement, so that we can genuinely, can build collective power. Because, I was, again, one of the things I was taught very, very early on, right? Yes, we have to organize in the trade unions, but being an organizer doesn't stop at the factory gates. It means you organize in our community and you bring the same principles there and vice versa. And that there's a gap there and there's a space. And I'm hoping this young radicals will pick up that mantle and reimagine what organizing it looks like for this moment.
I hope so, because one of the things, I mean, this kind of moment has drawn me back to reading some of the stuff of great people like Cedric Robinson, who talks about the Black radical tradition, in particular across a whole range of books. In particular, there's the famous Black Marxism book, but and there's a recent book, a collection of his writings, all about that Black radical tradition, because we forget that we don't just learn from other organizers in this country and in the United States, but we can learn from each other on the ground. And for me, that's one of the most important things about organizing is, we do it, but we have to learn as we do. And we learn from people around us who might never become famous names, who might never, be, kind of remembered in Black History Month or whatever, but actually have done such important work in bringing people together to learn from our experiences. And one of the things that's always lifted me, actually, about that organizing experience is how organic it is and how much people have really got that already, and they don't need to go on an organizing school quite often. It's almost instinctive, and people have it because people know what's right, basically. And there's things you can learn about doing stuff, but actually that Black radical tradition is so built in, so it's just there,
Absolutely. I look, and every generation has new language for everything, and I'm always struck. I'm privileged enough to be able to still work with a lot of young Black activists, and often, they talk about things like, you know, the importance of care. And when you start to unpack it, you go, you know what, we never used to talk about it that, but it was always really, it was just an instinctive part of our organizing. We used to organize around food. We used to recognize that there were people in our community you paid downwards. You took everybody, depending on where they were, there was a collective responsibility for everybody's well-being that was both economic and individual, and you know, and how consciousness was raised through that political struggle, right? And it was sharpened, but the importance of learning and education and sharing this real concrete knowledge and this history that you just want to absorb. And I mean, it's interesting because it's now sort of coming back into fashion, as in, you know, people see it, like if you go to any organizing boot camp, they say all these things, and I always stuck and say, that is radical Black community organizing. We used to do that, you know, without anybody telling us a teaching book, because it was just part and parcel of how
that's what you did.
how you organize. And I'm glad people are formalizing it and saying these are good techniques, but I would always want it to be that this was embedded and came up from our community rather than it's something that's imposed. It's very much in our DNA.
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of your kind of activism, so I mean, you know, through your time with the New and Monitoring Project, I mean, you eventually went on to serve on some of the boards of some of the most important NGOs in the country, Amnesty International and so on. You end up at for me, one of the most important, but I would say that because I'm on the Council of Management. But actually, before I was invited to put myself forward for election for that body, I always found it to be one of the most important. I first came across War on Want in the early 1980s when they were when I was working for Walsall Council, and the campaign to support Chile was running. So that was my first kind of contact. Can you say a little bit to us about not just the journey to War on Want, because I really now want to concentrate on War on Want, because for me it's one of the most important organisations around, as I've said. What is the kind of mission of War on Want?
So War on Want was founded by the labour movement, and it's still rooted in the labour movement, in the fact that all the national trade unions that are affiliated to it, one of our core working areas of work is around workers' rights, both in the UK and globally. So today, for example, we continue to support the McStrikers. We work with the Bakers Union on that. We work around exposing low pay and impacting neoliberal inequality, and work also globally. But it was set up to be very, very different from every other NGO. It said very explicitly from the beginning, we're going to focus on the root causes of poverty and inequality. We're going to stand with the Global South, and we're going to articulate the radical vision. So when it was set up, and its name comes from the only war worth fighting is the war against want, because it was set up also in opposition to the war in Korea in the 1950s, it took on an anti-colonial mandate. It stood with the anti-colonial struggles. It was the first international charity that was very, very explicit and said, you cannot address poverty, inequality, and violation of human rights until you're basically you take on colonialism. So we have to stand with that. We stood very brave with the anti-imperialist movement. We said the struggle of today of liberation in the Global South, whether it's the struggle of the peoples in Mozambique to the peoples in Chile, this is a prerequisite to dismantling the systems of oppression. It was at the forefront of the anti-globalization movement, helped define what the reality of neoliberalism was going to be, and for a decade in this country was the only charity that said we're against neoliberalism, and explicitly said we're against it. So it has a radical vision and a mission, and it tries to connect those issues together. We support social movements in the Global South. We support them financially, we support them politically, we amplify their voice, and we articulate their demands in this country. So when, for example, the South African people call for boycott, divestment, sanctions, War on Want was one of the first charities that took up their call. When the Palestinian people call for boycott, divestment, sanctions, War on Want was one of the first, was the only charity that at the time took up their call. We've explicitly always said our axis is in the global south, our organising is in the UK, and our key organising allies are the labour movement, because that is where we can build collective power, both inside the labour movement, but also outside. And today, you know, what we try and do when we look at the world, for example, and you look at the realities of what I call the permanent crisis for both the global south and the global south in the global north, i.e. the poorest parts of the global north, is of multiple crises. A crisis of neoliberalism and inequality, you know, forced privatization, ripping out of public services, you know, poverty pay, the dismantling of the weakening of labor laws, and the pushback against trade unions, you know, has meant that we've got 0-hour contracts and people living well below the living wage. The corona pandemic has simply exposed all the existing inequalities. And when we look at what's coming in the months ahead, you know, the reality of half the world's population being out of work, you know, half the world's population living on less than $5 a day. And the reality that since 1990 to this moment, poverty in absolute terms, when we say the number of people living on $5, hasn't changed one iota. It was 3.5 billion in 1990, it's 3.4 billion today. That 100 million has largely come from China and India as elites have. But the reality for the majority of the world is that they are sacrificed for an economic system that is intent on profiting from them and the resources. And so we've always been very, very clear that our mission is to focus on those root causes and to work alongside and build power. And today, you know, bringing in that perspective about the climate violence, as you mentioned earlier on, you know, I mean, that's a reality, right? If you look at the killer floods, droughts, and famines that are devastated everywhere in the world, you know, we all saw the pictures of Mozambique, for example, and last year with the cyclone. You know, when that cyclone hit, it left 1 million people on the brink of starvation in Mozambique. Now, the reason why they were on the brink of starvation was not simply because of the cyclone. It's because over decades, we had gutted Mozambique's ability to be able to provide for its own people. The West had taken part first in colonial exploitation of Mozambique, taking out resources. Then it had been in imperial wars when the liberation movements of Mozambique tried to throw off the yokes of colonialism. The multinationals dominate the commodities in Mozambique, exporting the capital profit back to the global north. And we forced structural adjustment programs and privatization of Mozambique such that it had no public service, no health services. And so when these multiple crises happen, states, even if they want to, are just unable to deal with this crisis upon crisis, the permanent crisis, as I call it. And I think this moment really is made for War on Want, which is how do you build a movement of movements, and how do you connect different issues, the struggles of both you know, racialized capitalism, neoliberal inequality, climate injustice, and, you know, the reality of historical exploitation of resources. Until you're able to bring those things together, I don't think we're going to be able to genuinely walk through from this moment to a better world. And
I think one of the things, Asad, is that one of the kind of developments in recent days, actually, that I think is really important in terms of understanding racial capitalism and what trade unions need to do to stand up against that. It's kind of coming out of the Black Lives Matter stuff, but it's the fact that next week we see the American trade union movement on Monday, I think, taking industrial action in support of the Black Lives Matter. I think that's an extraordinary moment for us all. But for me, it's more than just a tokenistic act. What it is it's the voice of Labour having a clear recognition about its role as a body, as a group of people, as millions of people, in standing up against racism, making the connection really clear. So I'm delighted. I'm going to be speaking at a rally in Liverpool on Monday in support. It's going to be one of my first times out, actually, but I'm just, if there was anything that I was going to come out and support, it was going to be something like that. That we have to show solidarity to movements like that. You know, where there is a recognition at last, many of us would say, about the importance of the trade union movement and having a clear and distinct voice against racism.
Absolutely. Look, you know, we come from a tradition, I would say, of race, class, and internationalism, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
This is this moment where I think, you know, we all know on the banners of every trade union movement banner, it doesn't say workers of England unite, it says workers of the world unite, you know, and working people are the ones that are facing the brunt of all of this violence, whether it's climate, racial, etc. And the exploitation that we face, whether than the injustices, are the exploitation that ultimately the labour movement faces as well. So this is not altruistic solidarity. It's a fundamental solidarity that recognises we have a common agenda and we have a common enemy, and we can only win if we can unite our movements. And as I said to you, we support the Bakers Union and the McStrikers, and we work with the SEIU in the US, and I think it's an incredible development to be able to for the strike for Black Lives Matter. And I hope that it brings back that legacy of Black radical trade unionism and the labour movement standing with communities in struggle outside of the factory gate. Because I think once we're able to do that, we're able to recognise that, you know, we'll look at what globalization has done to us, right? Globalization has created capital that works at a global level. You know, the authoritarian and populist right work at a global level. And yet we as progressives are increasingly forced into working, yes, in the nation state, because that's where we have to organize, but then limiting our imaginations and limiting our ability to act together only to the nation state. You know, UNISON, for example, absolute right to demand, you know, universal public services. But as we've seen with Corona, as it impacts on the global south, you know, the reality for people in the global south is they don't have access to public services. They don't have access to social protection. They don't have a guaranteed income or minimum wage, you know. So our demands can't be or, they have to be and. So we have to be able to unify and make absolutely everybody should have a guaranteed basic income. We should have universal public services. If we're going to have an NHS here, we should be going, why can't we have a global NHS? We need social protection here. Absolutely. We all seen the reality of what Corona has exposed for social protection and poverty and benefits. That needs to be universal. And we need workers' rights, because we know that that is the key tool in which we realize all the rest of our rights. But alongside that, we can't ignore the climate reality of climate change. So we have to make demands around that. Food and energy have to be public goods, because, you know, there are 2 billion people facing issues of hunger. The next pandemic, as everybody's predicting, is going to be a pandemic of hunger. You know, not because we can't feed the world, we can feed the world 3 times over. It's because it's more profitable for big business to plow food into the ground rather than allow food to be eaten by, you know, those in need, because the profit logic of exploiting those resources mean that shareholders and big business are making money. Alongside that, we know you can't fight and win these things until we fundamentally change the global financial system. That means the trading rules, how banking works, making sure taxation, you know, making multinationals pay their tax, and, you know, making sure we have a wealth tax. Because how does the global south have the resources to be able to even provide public services? You know, since 1980, you know, something like 16 trillion has flowed from the global south to the global north in capital profits, about 13 trillion in illicit tax flows from where they're going into secret tax havens, about 4.5 trillion in unsustainable debt repayments. And you know, so the reality is, when, for example, Corona impacted, and people here in the UK and some people in the UK were posting pictures of ducks and deers and saying nature is recovering, workers were walking thousands of kilometers in the global south, destitute. People were dying at train stations.
Oh
no, what's happened?
Oh, we've lost
Okay,
Asad.
we'll try and get Asad back. What a shame. Let's just see if I can get him back online again. Let's see. Oh, something's happened to his connection. Okay, we'll carry on. We've had a couple of questions from people. A lot of very positive comments. What a shame. That was so good.
Hopefully we get him back
Here he
on.
is. He's
Sorry,
back.
I am
He's
back.
back. There he
Oh,
is.
he's back. You back, mate?
Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Can't see you
Not
yet.
yet. Not yet, but we can hear you, Asad.
Okay, so yeah, well, hopefully, sorry, I don't
Just
know.
keep talking.
Crash
We've
for
got,
a second, but
so,
you know, so I won't bother. Well, let's see if we can get the screen up. But you know, so this is why I think, you know, we have to connect our national and our global demands. We know the global recession is coming along, right? We know it's going to impoverish people in this country, but it's going to impoverish people in the global south. Our solidarity has to be connected beyond borders, and you know, and again, hats off to UNISON, because I know UNISON does play a very active role in the international trade union movement and call for universal public services, and but I think this is the moment where we genuinely need the movement of movements, you know, bringing together the Black Lives Matter, the trade union movement, the climate justice movement, the movements around poverty and inequality, the movements around global South solidarity, into a, you know, what are the transformational policy demands that we can all make, and how do we support each other, and how do we ensure that what we demand here is as applicable to people in the global South, so that everybody in this world has the same rights to a dignified life.
excellent. I mean, I think that's absolutely the right place to leave as a reflection. It's not a question, it's a reflection that all of us need to think about, is how do we make sure that those things happen. One of the things I always ask people who come on this webinar to just to try and think about a little bit is a book recommendation. So is there a particular book that, given the things that we've talked about, that you found important in your kind of journey as an activist, or that's important for this particular moment?
Yeah, I actually had my book to pull to hand, because you can't see when I was there, but my bookshelf is, unlike everybody else, my bookshelf's in front of me. So as a young child, like I think for many of my generation and our generation, you know, the book that we all go to is, you know, the book that changed my world was reading Malcolm X's autobiography. And of course it did. It was like incredible when I first read that. But I came across then another book, and I always recommend it to people. And it's called Revolutionary Suicide by Huey P. Newton. And I always was struck by how this it's so simply written, but it's so powerful at this journey of this Black radicalism, which I think speaks to both that moment and has so many lessons for us today. So I think it's a forgotten sort of book in that interest around Black Panthers, because people know Bobby Seale Seized the Time, people obviously read Angela's and etc. And I you know, you look back at all of those, and either the state killed most of our, you know, our leaders, or you know, they died in such tragic circumstances, and Huey is one of those. I just, you know, you wonder if he'd lived to see this moment, what he would have said. But the other book I was going to recommend, and which I wish I was published when I was a child, was the Peter Fryer's The History of Black People in Britain. When I first read that, it just blew my mind, because he did such an amazing job. Now there is, I think, with social media, more access to stories about, you know, about the Black soldiers that were there at Hadrian's Wall, or how Black people were here during the Tudor time, or how Black people were involved in the Chartist movement. But at the time when this book came out, you know, you could only go and read this information if it was in a book. And in this one concise book, I just thought, what an amazing tour de force this was.
Is that staying power?
Yes, Staying Power: The History of Black People in
Power.
Britain.
Yeah.
It was, you know, and I used to buy so many copies and always give it to like young activists saying, you have to know, you know, so when people talk about us being immigrants in this country, you know, you have to know this to show them not only was the bricks and mortar of this country built through the exploitation of our peoples, whether it was through slavery and colonialism, but that we were instrumental in this country, in its development, and in some of the most important moments in British history. And the importance of knowing that, I think, is really important. It goes back to your first question. The trauma of being Black in the 80s, and all you ever saw of yourself was racist comedy shows, or you know, and the racist depictions that you know, and the slogans, and to have like positive affirmation of these incredible people, I think, you know, gives you strength, you know. So those I'm sorry it's not one book. Those were my two books.
No, there's lots of people who've done this webinar, have done more than one. That's absolutely fine. I'd forgotten about the Huey P. Newton one, actually, but that's one that I'll go and seek out again. I've read the others that you mentioned. Monica, have we got? I don't know if you're still okay for time, Asad. Whether you got time to answer a couple of questions?
I'm fine.
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah, great stuff. Lovely. We've got a very a quick question. This has come from an organizer in the Midlands. If you could pick one person who has inspired you, Asad, who would that be? Hello?
Still with us, Asad? Hello? Oh, we've lost him again.
Hello, Asad? He's there. I can see him. Maybe something's happened with his audio.
I'll tell you a little story here. You know, my mum went through this period where she had those English.
Hang on, Asad. Did you tell us who? Because we didn't hear. I don't think we've got all of your answer to that question. So could you start again, maybe? Hello. No.
I think we've got a little problem there with a bit of audio there, but we kind of have come to the full time, haven't we? Almost there.
But before we go, Monica, who's the person that's most inspired you?
You, Roger.
Of course, good. The right answer.
There you are. No question. No question there. That's worth the pay rise, isn't it?
You think?
I think Asad's back. Asad's back. He looks like he's on the phone. Can you hear us? No.
No, we'll have to call
That's
it
a shame. That was so good. That was so good.
Well, let's get that, because we need to have that question answered. So maybe if we ask Asad that question offline, and just put it in the link or something.
I will. I will.
When we put this out. So I think we're gonna. I think we're struggling with the technology now. So I think what I want to do is to thank Asad very, very much for giving up an hour. I thought that was inspiring contribution, really enjoyable conversation with one of my mates and comrades, but clearly somebody who has done so much in the movement around organising, and we've still got obviously so many organising challenges left to us, that gaining that sort of knowledge and experience that people have got, I just think is so valuable for the fights that we're going through now, but also the fights that we're going through we've got ahead of us, particularly when the latest attack comes from the government to pay for their mismanagement, frankly, of the coronavirus pandemic. So thank you, Asad. Sorry that we've had this problem with the technology right at the end of the thing, but we got mostly through the hour. And again, thank you, Monica, for all the work that you and Calvin and Joan have done in setting up this webinar. Oh, you're back. Hello.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know what just happened. I think maybe.
All right. Well, we come into. Well, I'm just doing the roundup. So the question that was asked to you, Asad, was who is the person that's most inspired you?
So I was just telling you a little story. When my mum wanted to learn English, this nurse actually volunteered, and she was an Asian woman, and she came to my house. My mum started asking her all sorts of personal stuff, like, you know, do you know how to cook, and do you know how to do all of these things, and then decided that that was her mission to teach all this. And that woman, her name was Rekha Patel, first spoke to me and said, so tell me about what's going on. And I tell her about all of these, you know, things that were going on at school about racist violence. And she handed me this leaflet about the Asian youth movement, and became like the person. She said, you should, you know, you should read this. And to this day, I would say that there's always been powerful women throughout my life who I've been lucky enough to be able to be politicized by, but she instilled in me this intersectional response, like analysis of saying, of understanding that you couldn't fight racism without fighting also sexism and patriarchy, without also fighting being internationalist, without all of those. And so I genuinely owe my politics to this nurse who randomly came because my mum decided that she wanted to learn English, and decided after that she didn't want to learn English but wanted to teach this nurse how to cook instead.
Excellent. I mean, Asad, I say personally now, but thank you ever so much for the last hour. It's been truly inspiring, mate. And I think it really is. One of the things we need in this moment is to be inspired to go out and organise. And I think your contributions this afternoon has helps us to remember that inspiration is all around us. And you're part of that inspiration as well, mate. So, I mean, thanks ever so much for all that you do for our movement, to keep, I think as the Reverend Jesse Jackson said, to keep hope alive, because hope is eternal, I think. So thanks for all that you do, mate. And thanks for giving up your time. Really appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Thank you very much.
You, and for the really kind invitation. It is a real pleasure, and absolute kudos to, you know, all of your organising team. I mean, I think, you know, as an organisation that you know, as I say, centres on the labour movement and workers' rights, you know, UNISON is a great champion and an ally and a great partner in so many struggles with us. So long may that continue. And our, of course, Rodney Bickerstaff was was the former president of War on Wanted, so we have a long and historic relationship with UNISON.
Yeah, talking about people who inspired. Certainly one of the people from his days back in National Union of Public Employees when I was a young steward coming through, who did so much to inspire me to be more active within the movement. So a lot of credit goes to Bic. Thanks, Asad. Thanks ever so much, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Great. See you later.
Thanks, mate.
Thank you.
Can I just wind up again by just reminding everybody that we've got one more of these webinars in the series, which we'll put the details out for in the next day or two, and that is going to be part 2 of our discussion with the legendary Bill Lucy. And that's got really something to look forward to in that, the development of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, and some discussion about some of the things going on in the US today from the perspective of one of the living legends of the civil rights movement. So that details will come out about that in the next day or so. Once again, can I thank everybody for giving up your time to come and listen and watch this webinar. Really appreciate it. And again, thanks to the team for helping to put this together. Thanks for listening. Take care. Bye now.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger. I'm going to switch the webinar. Recording will be sent out to everybody who registered and also on the organising space. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.